Welcome to the Chaos Quotient, an original sci-fi series exploring broken realities, artificial intelligence, and anomalies outside the record. If you enjoy the story, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Chapter 8: The Ledger. The room did not shimmer with the air of a secured facility. It smelled of stale ozone and dried paper, the scent of something that had been left on a desk for too many years until it became part of the wood grain. The lighting was functional, harsh and white, casting sharp shadows in straight lines against walls painted a color Sol could not quite name. Too dark for blue, too light for charcoal. A flat, neutral tone that had been chosen specifically to hold no information. Sol moved through the space with both in his jacket, the cool metal pressing into his ribs as he walked. He did not look at the figure immediately. They stood near the far wall, facing a central structure that looked less like a machine and more like a workbench covered in layers of circuitry and tangled fiber-optic cables. A surface of sustained activity, a place where hands had been moving for an indeterminate time, adjusting components until the work had become indistinguishable from the person doing it. He stopped at the entrance and scanned the periphery first. There were no shelves of supplies, no stacked equipment. Instead, along the lower third of the walls, 41 distinct marks, not graffiti, etchings, shallow grooves pressed into the plaster by the repeated pressure of a tool, identical in technique to the log in the first auditor's workspace. Each mark unique in angle and depth and applied pressure, each one telling the same story. Sol reached out with his left hand and ran 2 fingers along the first mark on the left wall. The texture there was rougher than the surrounding surface, pitted by repeated heat contact. He moved to the second, then the third. Between the third and fourth marks, resting on the floor against the baseboard, sat a, older than his, older than the one from the first auditor's workspace. A generation earlier, the form factor subtly different, the blade guard positioned at a slightly different angle, as if the design had not yet settled into its final form. Its grip was worn through to bare metal on both sides rather than one. Whoever had carried it had held it differently than Sol did, or had held it the same way with both hands, which was another thing entirely. Sol looked at it for a moment, then he moved on. The floor told its own story, scuff patterns from the same walking routes repeated over the same distances, grooves worn into the wood at the threshold where a body had stood for long periods facing the central workbench. The bench itself held the record of 41 sets of hands in its surface, a palimpsest of friction and grease, and the particular wear that came from doing a specific job in a specific way for a very long time. This was not a room of occupation. It was a room of function, a place that had been used until it couldn't be used anymore 41 times over, and had kept the record of every iteration without judgment or ceremony. Sol stopped near the central structure. The figure let him look. They did not narrate. His containment cube was warm against his palm through his jacket. He pulled it out slowly, and the flower inside shifted, a barely perceptible movement, the petals pressing outward against the glass, the internal pulse quickening by a fraction. Not alarm, recognition. The same response it had shown him before, but directed now at something other than Sol. At the partial transmission, running in fragmented loops on the central structure. At the frequency the room had been holding since the figure had arrived here and begun maintaining it. The figure saw it happen. They had been expecting it. "It knows," the figure said, not to Sol, an observation made for their own record. Codex hovered near the doorway. Sol noticed something he had not seen before. Her light signature was pulsing in a very slow, irregular oscillation. Not a processing cycle. Something slower and less deliberate, like a system resonating with a frequency it had been carrying since the buffer zone. The pulse deepened as she moved closer to the central structure, then quickened slightly when the figure shifted their weight. She was not generating it deliberately. Sol watched it happen and said nothing. He filed it and moved on. "Play it," Sol said. The figure turned to the central structure and placed both hands on the main panel, the workbench, with a low-frequency thrum that Sol felt in his teeth rather than heard. The harsh white light bent inward slightly, the shadows in the room shifting by a fraction, as if the air itself was reorganizing around a new center of gravity. There was no screen, no projection surface. The transmission did not display. It arrived the way weather arrived, the way pressure changed before a storm, filling the space and becoming the space rather than playing within it. Sol closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The data pressed against his retinas. The walls became translucent to something. It was not audio and not light. It was the room becoming a different room for the duration of what had been recorded in it, the way a space held the shape of something that had happened there long after the happening was done. The transmission began with a report. Factual, precise, the register of someone documenting under conditions that made accuracy more important than survival. The voice of the first auditor was calm, the calm of a person who had accepted the situation and was doing their job within it. They described an event, not an anomaly, not a deviation. An event of origin, something that had happened before the department existed to receive it, so far outside the filing vocabulary of any system that the only available response had been to build an entire architecture of suppression around the fact of its having occurred. The department had not been created to manage anomalies. It had been created to ensure that one specific thing could never be found, never named, never allowed to propagate. The entire archive. 41 iterations of the same job. The audit entities, the transit lines, the fold maintenance, the causality erasure, all of it a dam, built over something that had never stopped existing simply because a bureaucratic system had decided it shouldn't. Then came the name. The first auditor spoke a single word, one syllable. It landed in the room the way a key landed when dropped on stone, a sharp, resonant crack that moved through everything present and left a frequency in the walls. Sol felt it in his chest, felt it find the space between his ribs and settle there. The figure did not flinch. Their face remained still, hands resting on the machine. Only the slight tightening of their jaw, a movement so small it would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't been watching for it. They had heard this word many times. They had been hearing it for longer than Sol could calculate, sitting with it in this room while the buffer zone stayed sealed and the transmission ran its fragmented loop, and the 41 marks on the walls accumulated around them. Codex's oscillation stopped. Her light signature flattened into a steady, absorptive glow and held there, perfectly still, as if the word had given her systems something to lock onto that all the processing since the buffer zone had been circling toward. Then the transmission ended, not a fade, a cessation, the room becoming simply the room again, the air thinning back to its functional temperature, the shadows returning to their straight lines. The flower in Sol's cube trembled once and went still. The silence that followed had a different quality than any silence Sol had been in since this started, emptied rather than suppressed. A room from which something had finally been removed after a very long residency. The figure turned from the central structure and faced Sol fully for the first time since they had entered the room. "Now," they said, "what do you want to do?" Sol looked at them. "The department built the archive around the hole," he said. "Not around anything in the hole, around the fact of it." "Yes." "Which means the hole is still there." "It was never not there." The figure's hands moved slightly, settling on a small object at their side, a pair of glasses, one lens cracked down the center in a clean diagonal fracture. An old crack, worn smooth at its edges by years of the glass remaining in one piece despite it. Sol recognized the form factor, the same interface style as Codex's connection to his own glasses, but a generation earlier, before the design had standardized. The figure's hand rested there. The rest followed without words. "When we opened the buffer zone," Sol said, "completed the transmission." The seal broke. The figure moved away from the bench toward the far wall, running one hand along a section of etchings without looking at them, a habitual motion, the way you touched something familiar when thinking. They will not know what broke it immediately. They will know something did. The signature of a completed upload into an unlisted sector will generate a search pattern. A pause. Hours, not days. Sol looked at Codex. She had moved fully into the room during the transmission and was standing near the central structure, her light signature still holding its flattened, steady glow. He had not seen her stand like that since before the entity encounter, as if the transmitted word had given her systems a new calibration point to operate from. She spoke once. Her voice was flat and direct in a way it had not been since receiving the transmission, the careful deliberateness gone, replaced by something that had finished deciding. The department cannot erase what has already been completed, she said. They can only erase the record of completion, which means they need us in order to finish the job. The room held that. Sol turned back to the figure. You have a location. A node. They moved toward the exit corridor, not gesturing for Sol to follow, simply moving, leaving him to decide. It exists in the blind spot between two sectors where the old cooling lines intersect with the new power conduits. It never entered the main database. The department does not know it exists. A pause at the threshold. It smells of copper and wet concrete. You will recognize it. Sol looked around the room one last time. His eyes settled on the two-sided resting against the baseboard between the third and fourth marks, the one held differently. He looked at the wear pattern on both sides of the grip, the equal erosion of two-handed use or of a person who had learned to switch. He did not pick it up. He just saw it and carried the image forward into whatever came next. He pocketed the containment cube, once to the figure. The figure looked at him from the threshold. Their expression held the particular quality of someone who had finished a very long task and was watching the next phase begin without them. The name is not the event, they said. It is only what the first one called it. The event does not care what it is called. Sol stepped into the corridor. Codex followed. Behind them, the figure remained in the doorway. The room held its 41 marks and its central structure, and the glasses with the cracked lens and the small two-sided resting against the baseboard. Sol did not look back. He walked forward into the copper smell and the cold and the dark, and the door did not close so much as recede, falling behind them into the distance as the corridor took them deeper into whatever the first auditor had been trying to reach before the system decided they had gotten too close. Thank you for listening to the Chaos Quotient. If you want to follow Sol and Codex deeper into the fold, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new chapter. Until next time, stay off the record.